The 2026 General Appropriations Bill, the parliamentary status of which is that we are in the period of interpellation. Mr. President, I further move that we now consider the budget of the Department of the National Defense, the Office of the Secretary, Proper Government Arsenal, National Defense College of the Philippines, Office of the Civil Defense, and I further move that we now recognize the distinguished sponsor, our Chair Committee of Finance, Senator Win Gatchalian, and to interpolate Senator Rodante Marcoleta.
All right. Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of House Bill 4058, Conduct Committee Report number 18 is in order. We recognize Senator Sherwin Gatchalian to sponsor the budget of the Department of National Defense and to interpolate Senator Marcoleta, but the sponsor is recognized first to place on record the budget.
Maraming salamat, Senate President, Majority Leader. Thank you very much. Mr. President, we respectfully submit for the body's consideration the fiscal year 2026 proposed new appropriations for the Department of National Defense and its attached agencies amounting to 305.5 billion pesos. And the breakdown is as follows. For the Office of the Secretary, 2.3 billion pesos. For the Government Arsenal, 2.8 billion pesos. For the National Defense College of the Philippines, 300 million pesos. For the Office of the Civil Defense, 2.6 billion pesos. For the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, 1.6 billion pesos. For the Veterans Memorial Medical Center, 4.9 billion pesos. For the Armed Forces of the Philippines, 290.7 billion pesos. Of the 290.7 billion pesos allocated to the AFP, 145 billion pesos is for the Philippine Army, 60.3 billion pesos is for the Philippine Air Force, 59.9 billion pesos is for the Philippine Navy, and 25 billion pesos is for the General Headquarters AFP and AFP-wide service support units. We likewise submit to the body for the body's consideration the fiscal year 2026 proposed new appropriations of the revised AFP modernization program in an amount of 60 billion pesos under the program appropriations and another 30 billion pesos under the unprogram appropriations. Maraming salamat, Senate President.
All right, thank you. The Senator Dante Marcoleta is recognized to interpolate.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for time accommodation in order to fulfill a very important social obligation today. Mr. President, I'd like to start with defense alliances with the United States, Japan, and Australia. The first question is, to what extent does the 2026 budget assume U.S., Japanese or Australian support in case of a major WPS contingency?
Well, Mr. President, there's no particular item for the U.S., Japan, and Australian arrangement. It forms part under the visiting forces arrangement, Mr. President, and the exercises being conducted is subsumed under the operational budgets of the different agencies, Mr. President. So there's no particular item for the U.S., for Japan, for Australia. It's subsumed under the exercises being conducted and subsumed under those budgets, Mr. President.
And that will mean, Mr. President, that no critical capabilities are still being outsourced from these allies.
Mr. President, the arrangement between our allies is focused on different aspects, no? Intelligence sharing, cybersecurity partnerships, as well as interoperability arrangements. We also purchase a large amount of our modernization from our allies, particularly Korea and the United States.
But Mr. President, if we consider the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and the Philippines, a treaty which was signed in 1951, I don't think the United States is accomplishing its obligation under the treaty, more particularly Article 2. May I cite that particular provision, Mr. President? Article 2 of the Mutual Defense Treaty says that in order to more effectively achieve the objectives of this treaty, parties, meaning the U.S. and the Philippines, separately and jointly by self-help or mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. Can we say, Mr. President, that at present the Philippines is capable of resisting armed attack?
The answer from the Department of National Defense depends on the degree of the armed attack, Mr. President. And that's why we have interoperability exercises with our allies, Mr. President, so that we can be prepared for any eventuality, including disaster preparedness, Mr. President, which is, I think, a much more critical preparedness activity that we need to endeavor.
The treaty, Mr. President, did not distinguish the nature and kind of armed attack. It just said both parties should be capacitated to repel armed attack. So the question is our country in a position to repel armed attack? Let's say from Vietnam.
Well, it really depends, Mr. President, on the degree of the armed attack, Mr. President. So
You should consider the strength of the Vietnamese army. Can we just... we cannot imagine how much force or what is the extent of armed attack. These countries whom we want to attack us will not tell us. Kaya nga, paano natin magagamit yung Article 2? Is it not proper for us to at least make ourselves capable of whatever attack? That should be the ideal objective. And the Mutual Defense Treaty should be able to accomplish this. This is the main objective. That's why I'm asking you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, one of the aim of the DND is to continue to modernize our capability, Mr. President. That's why we have allocated 60 billion pesos in the budget to continuously support the modernization of our armed forces, Mr. President.
But that is not answering the question, Mr. President. I'm asking whether our country is in a position to repel armed attack. This is the objective of the Mutual Defense Treaty. If we continuously hide upon the argument that we are perennially being assisted by the United States, Japan, and Australia, we're compromising our sovereignty and strategic autonomy, Mr. President. So ba't meron pa po tayong Mutual Defense Treaty? We cannot even answer the simple question.
Mr. President, with the present capability and the continuous upgrading of our military capability, the objective is to deter instances like what you have mentioned, Mr. President.
You're saying, Mr. President, we are in a position to deter For example, China from attacking us. Can we now deter China from attacking us?
Yes, Mr. President, the Secretary answered in the affirmative.
So what are the deterrents, or what is the deterrence, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, as we have seen in the news that our troops are continuously training, continuously holding exercises with our allies. So with the capability of our troops and also with the partnership with our allies, Mr. President, these are the components that can bolster our deterrence, Mr. President.
That is the only answer that you can provide, Mr. President.
Mr. President, that is the objective of the Department of National Defense, Mr. President.
But Mr. President, I'm asking in relation to the Mutual Defense Treaty. This is a very important treaty. It is, I think, 74 years old. If we maximize that treaty, hindi naman po siguro tatagal. After 74 years, hindi pa po natin masabi na kung ano ang ating napala dito sa Mutual Defense Treaty. Mas matanda pa po sa akin ang treaty ito, Mr. President.
Mr. President, from my observation, yung interoperability, yung balikatan exercises is a clear evidence that we are operationalizing the treaty. Yung treaty ho, papel lang ho yan eh. Kung hindi ho nating ilalagay yan sa action through the balikatan exercises, through modernizing our capability, to coming up with our own modernization program, hindi ho talaga magiging beneficial yung treaty na yan. So, makikita naman ho natin na tuloy-tuloy po ang paglalaan po ng pondo sa ating AFP at tuloy-tuloy rin po nila ginagawa yung kanilang makakaya with the limited budget that we have, no? Sana ho mas malaki, but with the limited budget that we have, yung kanilang mga exercises para po makaresponde ho sila kung ano man ang pwedeng mangyari.
Sabi po niyo kanina, Mr. President, wala naman po tayong na-outsource sa ating mga partners. It is inconsistent, Mr. President. Tinatanong ko po kanina, gaano po sa ating budget ang ma-assume natin na suporta mula sa tatlong mga kaibigan natin. Ang sabi po niyo, wala.
Yeah. May nabanggit ko ho kanina, like for example, intelligence sharing, nabanggit ko rin, nasabi ko rin ho kanina yung cybersecurity capabilities and cybersecurity capacitation. Yun po yung mga ilan sa mga ina-outsource ho natin. At partnership, hindi lang ho outsourcing, but in my view, these are partnerships. Ang mundo ho naman ay interconnected na ho ngayon at hindi ho natin pwedeng sabihin na tayo lang ang gagawa. So we have partnerships with our allies, Mr. President. But a more detailed discussion should be limited to a executive session, and the Secretary is more than willing to brief His Honor on the details of those outsourcing and partnership, Mr. President. Marami ho dito may national security concern, pero open naman po ang ating Secretary na pag-usapan yun through an executive session.
What clear red lines and conditions has the Philippines communicated to the US, Japan, or Australia regarding the use of EDCA sites, yung joint patrols po natin and exercises, so that our territory is not used for offensive operations unrelated to Philippine defense and security?
Yeah. Well, under the Constitution ho, hindi ho pwede silang magtayo ng base militar ho dito. So itong mga EDCA sites ay ginagamit ho to for joint exercises as well as disaster preparedness. So ang may-ari po ng mga lupa ay tayo pa rin, ang Pilipinas pa rin. Ang nag-ooperate rin po ay tayo pa rin, ang Pilipinas pa rin. So wala ho silang responsibility sa pag-ooperate ho nun.
Given the inclusion of EDCA, Mr. President, EDCA sites near Taiwan Strait and the WPS, what risk assessment has DND made that these facilities will not become targets in a possible U.S.-China conflict, not our own making?
Based on the reply of the good secretary, their risk assessment is very low, Mr. President.
With the reciprocal access agreement with Japan, enhanced defense cooperation with Australia, what types of operations are explicitly ruled out on Philippine soil or in waters? Example, preemptive strikes, offensive cyber operations, long-range missiles deployments. If you can please specify, Mr. President.
Ang limitation po ay offensive operation and anything that will and anything that will pertain to engagement in war, Mr. President, as an instrument of national policy, Mr. President.
Mr. President, does the Department of National Defense agree that a decision of the Supreme Court interpreting and applying a provision of EDCA automatically becomes part of EDCA itself?
Mr. President, the reply of the Secretary, it's this positive portion reflects that, Mr. President. It automatically becomes part of.
Well, the question requires an answer of either yes or no, Mr. President. What is the dispositive portion, Mr. President?
The reply of the Secretary, Mr. President, it's part of the ruling and it's part of the ratio decidendi, Mr. President.
Yes, of course. The decision of the Supreme Court always form part of our legal system, Mr. President. And we're referring to Ochoa, Sagisag versus Ochoa, Mr. President, where the Supreme Court interpreted Article 4 of EDCA regarding the unimpeded access of the U.S. to a military equipment, material, and supply that it has prepositioned in the Philippines. That is correct, Mr. President.
Mr. President, if that is in the ruling, then that is correct, Mr. President.
And therefore, Mr. President, you have to agree that such interpretation of the Supreme Court should automatically form part of EDCA, correct?
Yes,
Yes.
subject to the full Constitution.
And therefore, the DND has the legal mandate to implement that interpretation of the Supreme Court.
Yes, Mr. President, that's correct.
Ang sabi po kasi sa kasong ito, o decision na ito, Mr. President, it was interpreted, meaning Article 4 of EDCA, that the U.S. has unimpeded access only to those military equipment, material, and supplies that the Philippines has consented to be prepositioned on Philippine territory.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
could the DND please detail how exactly it is implementing that decision of the Supreme Court, specifically what consent mechanism it is using? Is it the Mutual Defense Board or the Security Engagement Board?
Well, Mr. President, all channels are
Boards merely recommend
inform, Mr. President, that the boards are merely recommends, and the secretaries of the DFA and the DND are the ones who approve it, Mr. President.
When we say the boards, Mr. President, we're referring to MDB and the SEB.
Yes, Mr. President, correct.
How many come from the Philippine side, Mr. President? And what is the voting requirement?
It's 7-7, Mr. President, in the board.
But the board is billion.
Has there been an instance, Mr. President, when the Philippines did not allow the U.S. to preposition a certain military equipment, material, or personnel?
Well, Mr. President, the Secretary relayed that they're not at liberty to divulge that the answer to that, Mr. President.
May we know the reason, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, because it forms part of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and
National security.
it's also part of the operational security, and the President needs to approve the release of that information, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the armed forces of the Philippines mentioned that certain U.S. missiles should be prepositioned in the Philippines. Are these nuclear-capable missiles, Mr. President?
Mr. President, no, they're not. They're not nuclear missiles, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the 2006 U.S.-Bulgaria Defense Cooperation Agreement, the 2009 U.S.-Poland Status of Forces Agreement, and the 2014 U.S.-Australian Force Posture Agreement all explicitly require the United States forces to notify and obtain the exclusive consent of the host government regarding the type of defense equipment, supplies, or material to be propositioned. The U.S.-Australia agreement even provides for a snapback by the Australian Parliament. The Philippine EDCA does not have such consent provision. Why is the Department of National Defense not insisting on that insertion of such sovereign provision, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President, that provision, the reply of the Secretary, the provision is not necessary because the guiding document will be the Constitution, Mr. President.
But Mr. President, would not such sovereign provision ensure the independence of our foreign and security policies? Aside, of course, from the Constitution.
Well, Mr. President, any action in relation to the EDCA sites, the Philippine side will have the final say, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces recently said that all the investigations into and protests against the government corruption are causing destabilization and benefiting China. Do you agree that the work of the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee is destabilizing the Philippine government?
Well, personally, Mr. President, that's part of our mandate under the Constitution.
Yes.
And the investigation is in aid of legislation, Mr. President.
Kaya nga po, kaya hindi tayo nagdi-destabilize kahit na po tayo ay gumagawa ng pagdinig laban sa corruption na nangyayari sa ating bansa, lalong-lalo na po itong karumal-dumal na flood control projects na nakita po natin kung anong...
Mr. President, well, thank you, Mr. President, for asking that question. It gives the Chief of Staff the opportunity to clarify and also to straighten the answers, Mr. President. He never said that the investigation would lead to destabilization or any instability in our political system. What he mentioned is withdrawal of the support of the AFP will lead to destabilization. So, and that's very clear, Mr. President, the difference between the responsibilities of the legislature in aid of legislation and also the withdrawal of the support of the military, Mr. President.
Do you agree in the Philippines one China policy? Do you agree with Japan that any forcible unification of China and Taiwan is a threat to Philippine security?
Well, Mr. President, the policy is we adhere to the One China policy. But of course, the actions succeeding to that will be subject for discussion, Mr. President.
And you do not agree with Japan?
Mr. President, for now that is hypothetical and it's so there. Yeah, correct. It's hypothetical and that is the statement of Japan, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Vietnam's policy of no military alliance has enabled it to develop an indigenous capability to produce military drones. Do you think the Philippines should forever rely on external military assistance or try to stand on our own?
Well, that's the direction, Mr. President, to be self-reliant on our military needs, Mr. President, and hopefully later on we can invite investors to come here and build facilities that will manufacture drones and other military equipment, Mr. President. That's the aspiration, Mr. President.
But only if conditions will provide in order for this opportunity to come in the near future.
Mr. President, the proposal of the Department of National Defense is to amend the Self-Reliant Defense Posture Law. That will allow equity investments, Mr. President, in the Philippines so that we can attract defense manufacturers to come here to the Philippines. Like, for example, Korea is a big defense exporter and we can invite them to set up shop here, Mr. President. That is the direction.
What lessons from the Russian-Ukraine war have our experts in the DND derived in relation to the need for indigenous military capability?
Well, Mr. President, there are many lessons that the department derived from that Russian-Ukraine war. One is the indigenous capability in manufacturing, Mr. President, and actually I've seen some documentaries that because of that war, the Ukraine defense manufacturing industry had a resurgence. They now produce virtually most of the things that they need to repel the Russian invasion. Number two is another lesson is you cannot rely on one country in terms of one country alone to on both sides, Mr. President, on defense support, Mr. President. So it's important to also have alliances with different like-minded nations, Mr. President.
So what steps does the DND take, Mr. President, to build our indigenous military capability and If so, which part of the budget that we now consider will be devoted to ensuring such indigenous capability?
Well, Mr. President, the aspiration is to produce our own technology, defense technology, Mr. President. But the department strongly recommends the amendment of the Self-Reliance Defense Posture Law so that government can so the government can invest in research and development as well as the government can invest in defense manufacturing investments, Mr. President. So because of that law, there are limitations in terms of what government can do in defense manufacturing, Mr. President.
I'd like to hear a better word, Mr. President, than aspiration. Parang aspiration, malayong-malayo pang mararating na. Can we use another term para kahit paano
The vision.
hindi yung lilipad-lipad na
The vision. The actualization, Mr. President. Yun naman talaga ho ang gusto ho natin because it also creates jobs and technology transfer. But it's, as you know, the defense is also very complicated and the technology is not readily available.
Yes, Mr. President, talagang yun ang aking gustong tunguhan kasi can you imagine the Mutual Defense Treaty is 74 years old? Kahit papaano nating kwentahin ito, Mr. President, talagang wala. Pasensya na kayo kung exasperated ako
Pero Mr. President, if you've seen the last 3 years, yung mga balikatan exercises have ramped up tremendously, Mr. President. And that's clear evidence that the Mutual Defense Treaty is doing its responsibility, Mr. President.
yes, but they fell short in being able to satisfy our requirement that our country is now in a clear position of being able to repel armed attack. Ayoko nang bumalik doon. Yung kasilangang punto ron Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, last comment, actually under the leadership of Secretary Teodoro, doon po talaga nag-umpisa itong ramping up ng mga alliances with our like-minded partners, Mr. President. And with that, doon rin nag-umpisa yung investments rin ho natin sa modernization. No? Kaya this year, Mr. President, pinakamalaking modernization fund ang ilalagay po ng Senado para po makahabol ho tayo sa mga pangangailangan ho natin.
Yun po yung gusto ko sabihin, Mr. President. Nakabawi tayo ng konti dahil nandyan ang aking kaibigan, Secretary Teodoro. Kung wala pa siya dyan, paano na? Kasi hindi natin masasabi kung mananatili siya dyan. Pwede siyang
Yung palang punto nyo, Mr. President, nakuha ko na ho.
Kaya nga Would you say that militarization rather than diplomacy is the main mode of dispute settlement of China?
No, Mr. President, absolutely not, Mr. President.
Okay. So, ang main tool po natin is diplomacy insofar as the Philippines is concerned.
Yes, Mr. President. But it's at the same time, Mr. President, it's to our best and core interest to continuously modernizing our capability, Mr. President.
Yung po mga diplomatic efforts natin, ano-ano po yun? Sana hindi lang po mga diplomatic protest tsaka yung tinatawag nilang megaphone diplomacy. Are there actual negotiations and are there budgets devoted for these actual negotiations para yung diplomacy makita natin po talagang nag-ooperate?
Mr. President, under the budgets of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Mr. President, merong mga amounts there to continuously engage our partners as well as other countries in diplomacy, Mr. President.
Mr. President, is it correct to say that the Department of National Defense is asking the people for billions of pesos to defend the West Philippine Sea or WPS?
But Mr. President, it's not only limited to the West Philippine Sea, Mr. President. It's the
Yeah,
former.
in relation only to the West Philippine Sea.
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. Pwede paano natin isang map? Can we ask the staff to please show the first map? Mr. President, hindi ba lalaki ng konti? Palagin mo. Mr. President, I'm trying to show the official map of the South China Sea as published by the International Hydrographic Organization in S-23 or Limits of Oceans and Seas. We're not supposed to defend the entire South China Sea, Mr. President.
No, Mr. President. Only
Only-
our exclusive until our
Only the
exclusive-
portion of the
Yeah,
West Philippine Sea.
Yes, Mr. President, until the exclusive economic zone, and also in the other side, Mr. President.
Hindi, doon muna tayo sa
Eastern seaboard,
West,
Mr.
sa
President.
West Philippine Sea muna tayo. Isa-isa lang, boss. Mahirap ang kalabanan. Can you tell me, Mr. President, exactly which portion is the West Philippine Sea? Can you show us a map indicating the features and the limits of that area where we will be spending some of the budgets of the DND for consideration?
Mr. President, it's 200 nautical miles from our baseline, Mr. President. Those are the areas that the DND intends to bolster, Mr. President.
If you are saying 200 nautical miles from the archipelagic baseline, you're referring to the exclusive economic zone.
Correct, Mr. President.
The reason I'm raising this question, Mr. President, is that the lack of precise identification of the area where the people's money is supposed to be spent, parang ang mangyayari po parang yung flood control ngayon. Dahil po sa discrepancy in coordinates, ang damit billion po kasi ang natapon din na pera. If the DND says that the WPS is the EEZ, meron pong mas magandang definition yun. Sa Administrative Order Number 29 ng Republic Act 12064 o the Maritime Zones Law, sinasabi po ron the WPS is Philippines maritime areas on the western side of the archipelago, including the Luzon Sea, as well as the waters around, within and adjacent to the Calayan Island Group and Bajo de Masinloc, also known as Scarborough Shoal. Tama po yun, Sir President?
Yes, correct, Mr. President.
Would you agree that under Administrative Number 29, the term Calayan Island Group refers to the area enclosed by boundaries identified under Section 1 of Presidential Decree Number 1596?
Tama po, Mr.
Yes.
President. Tama po kayo.
And you will also agree that under paragraph 574 of Arbitral Award in the South China Sea Arbitration, the tribunal declared that the Philippines cannot apply boundaries to enclose the Spratly Islands or a portion thereof. Yes.
Yes, we agree. We agree with the arbitral award, Mr. President.
Ito po yung section po ng 1596, Mr. President, and paragraph 574 ng Arbitral Award. Magkalaban po talaga Sabi po ng Arbitral Award, Mr. President, and I quote, "In any event, however, even the Philippines could not declare archipelagic baselines surrounding the Spratly Islands. Article 47 of the Convention limits the use of archipelagic baselines to circumstances where within such baseline are included the main islands, and an area in which the ratio of the area of the water to the area of the land, including atolls, is between 1 to 1 and 9 to 1. Question, is it obvious now that PD 1596 and paragraph 574 of the arbitral award, Mr. President, are incompatible? And therefore, you will agree that definition of the WPS in Administrative Order 29 had to be changed to make it compatible with the arbitral award, Mr. President.
Well, Mr. President, the Secretary replied that no, it's not incompatible because portions of the EEZ is also included in that, Mr. President.
We will go to that, Mr. President, but if you will care to consider yung Section 1 po ng Presidential Decree 1596 and the arbitral award, they are inconsistent and incompatible. Kasi po dito sa Article 2, Paragraph B ng Republic Act 12064, nire-define niya yung WPS. Ang definition na po rito ngayon ng naging batas na ito ay the maritime zones of the Philippines on the western side of the Philippines on the Philippine archipelago, including the Luzon Sea and the territorial seas about the Masinloc and the maritime features of the Calayan Island Group. Ngayon po, Mr. President, yung limits po ng West Philippine Sea, ang sabi po natin kanina is the 200 nautical limit of the EEZ. Are you saying that Kalayaan and other features are not part of the WPS, Mr. President?
Mr. President, the prevailing law is RA 9522. That is the one that they are following, Mr. President.
RA
9522. Republic Act 9522.
Enacted in 2009.
Enacted in 2009, Mr. President.
So, paano po yung Republic Act number 12064? 2012 po ito. This is the more recent law.
Yeah, Mr. President, maritime zones and the baselines are different matters, Mr. President.
Alam ko po yun, Mr. President. Pero kung pag-uusapan po natin na yung limit po ng West Philippine Sea ay yung ating exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles from our baseline, malinaw po na ang Kalayaan Island Group ay hindi po kasali sapagkat it is beyond the West Philippine Sea. Pwede po natin ipakita yung pangalawang mapa.
Well, Mr. President, what we are following insofar as the Kalayaan Group of Islands is RA 9522, which defines the baseline, Mr. President, of the country.
And which is
Yun nga po, Mr. President, sa baseline natin, kahit sa 9522, wala po doon yung Kalayaan Island Group.
Mr. President, nandun po yung KIG, Mr. President, Kalayaan Island Group.
Ipakita natin yung yung isa pa pong ayan po, kayo na pong humanap kung nasaan yung KIG. Wala po eh.
Ito po, Mr. Section 2, Section 2A, the Kalayaan Island Group as constituted under Presidential Decree 1596. And letter B, Bajo de Mansinloc, also known as Scarborough Shoal, Mr. President. Nandito ho siya sa 952.
Kasi po, Mr. President, sa Republic Act 12064 or the Maritime Zones Law, ito po yung ginagamit ninyo ngayon eh. inalis po niya yung boundaries ng 1596 na in-enclose ang KIG. Tingnan po ninyo, Section 5 in relation to Section 18, yung term Calayan Island Group now refers only to certain high tide elevations and the respective territorial sea. Inalis po talaga eh.
For territory 9522.
Yeah. But Mr. President,
Ano ba yung
the
cost ng maritime zones?
when it comes to the Calayan Island Group, Mr. President, it's RA 9522.
Hindi po,
that
ang
protects,
ating
Mr.
pong
President.
recent batas na po, yung RA 12064, it was enacted last year, November 7, 2024. So hindi po pwedeng manaig po yung sinasabi nyo dahil ito na po yung more recent na batas na ginawa po natin. So as it stands now, Mr. President, yung ating West Philippine Sea includes the maritime features of the KIG. Palagay natin. And that some of these features are separated by high seas. Kung mangyayari po yun, Mr. President, ang mangyayari talaga, ang WPS is a discontinuous and disjointed body of water.
But Mr. President, also in Section 3 defines the baselines, Mr. President, and it referred back to RA 9522, Mr. President. So, dinefine dito sa batas na ito, yung baseline ng ating bansa at pinifer niya bumalik ho tayo sa 9522. So, hindi ho siya inconsistent, Mr. President. The maritime zones only define the maritime zones kung saan po pwedeng dumaan yung barko, Mr. President. But in terms of the baseline, it refers back to 9522, which includes the Calayan Island Group, Mr. President.
Hindi nga po eh, yung batas po na binabanggit natin na atin pong ipinasa last year, inalis niya na po yung KIG. Wala na po roon eh.
With all due respect, Mr. President, nandito ho kami nung we were discussing this law, and with all due respect, hindi ho ganun yung nangyari, Mr. President.
Kaya nga po, kung sakaling sabihin natin na ang WPS now will include the maritime features of the KIG, exactly how many features are we talking about here? Can you name and locate each of these features? Can you see us or can you show us the official map?
Nine major islands, Mr. President. That is the, there are 9 major islands, Mr. President.
Doon po sa KIG?
Hindi lang KIG.
Hindi lang po sa KIG, but yung mga features po sa...
Yun nga po, ang pinakamahirap dito po, dahil wala pa po tayong official map ng West Philippine Sea, hindi po natin madidescribe lahat ang features. At kung meron pong isang mang Pilipino ang naaring mabuhay doon. I'm asking these questions, Mr. President, to make certain that we know what we are talking about when we say West Philippine Sea. Nung po kasing ito'y unang nabanggit nung nasa mababang kapulungan ako, dahil nga po sa hindi pagkakaintindi sa isyong ito, nung sinabi ko na ang West Philippine Sea tayo lang ito. But in the context of international law, hindi po talaga alam pa. Ang alam po nila ay yung South China Sea. Can you imagine, Mr. President, the discomfort, for example, of a passenger in a plane about his safety or her safety, kung marinig niya yung pilot at saka yung control tower, nagdidebate sila kung nasan siya lugar. Sabi ng pilot, I am here in the West Philippine Sea. Hindi maintindihan ngayon nung control tower. Ganun po kasi, after more than 16 years or maybe 12 years since 2012, nung ipasa po natin yung RA 12064, the Philippines has not applied with International Hydrographic Organization for the adoption of the name West Philippine Sea. Yun po kasi yung naging problema yata natin, Mr. President. Bakit po kaya?
Well, Mr. President, I think that question will be best referred to the Department of Foreign Affairs, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President, in proper time we will do that. But I guess considering that the West Philippine Sea is one of those areas that even our national defense officials are protecting or try to protect. Kailangan po alam natin kung ano yung ating gustong proteksyonan. Ang sabi pa nga po ng ibang mga advocates, WPS, atin to. Mga ganun na, di ba? China, umalis ka sa WPS. Even our president said in his statements, West Philippine Sea is worth dying for. We'd like to see and would like to know, Mr. President, when we send our children and grandchildren to war protecting the West Philippine Sea, alam natin kung nasan talaga. What are the exact coordinates? Ngayon po talagang ang labo talaga eh. Parang sinabi mo, yung Pasig River, some portion of Taguig, some portion of Pasig, and some portions of another municipality. Hindi mo alam kung saan nagsimula, kung saan napuputol. Maybe we can ask the Executive Department to be precise in its identification of the features and limits of the West Philippine Sea. Kasi po, para yung mga ghost missions or even ghost budgets, I guess nangyari nga po sa flood control, they were all using several applications. Hindi sila magkakaiba po eh. Sabi pa nila, geotag, real time. Pero ang punting nan talagang wala yung mga flood control projects. So dito po ganun din, kailangan matukoy natin. Speaking of maritime features, Mr. President, let me refer back to the map identifying its features. Ito pong, yung balik mo nga dun sa pangalawang mapa. Ayan. You will agree, Mr. President, that based on that map, Vietnam occupies 21 features, China 9, and the Philippines 9.
The Philippines 11, Mr.
O 11 siguro. So 21 features for China, for Vietnam, 9 for China, Philippines 11.
Mr. President.
What is the policy of the national defense regarding Vietnam?
Well, Mr. President, in the case of Vietnam, Vietnam is not actively trying to add more areas to their to their territory, Mr. President. Unlike China, Mr. President.
21 na kasi nakuha niya eh.
So that's why in the case of Vietnam, meron ho tayong mga trust building activities and diplomatic activities with
So pare-pare
Vietnam.
tayong claimants dito, Mr. President. Are we going to force Vietnam out of these features?
With Vietnam, Mr. President, we have open communication lines with them, and these communication lines will also discuss this type of issues, Mr. President.
What about with China, Mr. President?
Well, with China, it's a different case because we all know that China is trying to claim our territories even within the inclusive economic zone, Mr. President. Nevertheless, diplomatic approaches is still the approach that we are endeavoring towards China, Mr.
Pero
President.
sabi natin kanina, Mr. President, yung open and actual negotiations ay ating ginagawa, and even ask kung magkano ang budget natin dito sa actual negotiation, hindi lang naman megaphone.
The budgets are in the DFA, Mr. President, and the amounts are not significant because this is part of their diplomatic activities, Mr. President.
Hindi natin sila mapapaalis at hindi naman yun ang policy natin, Mr. President. So if that is the case, ang Vietnam ba, ang China, ay paalisin tayo sa mga inoccupy nating features?
Sa Vietnam, wala po. Wala pong ganun. In fact, we have good relations with Vietnam. Maraming nga hong Pinoy na teachers nagtuturo po sa Vietnam. With China is a different case, as you know, Mr. President.
Sa China is a different case. So, maaari tayong puwersahing umalis, Mr. President.
Mr. President, we still the approach of our policymakers is to continue to engage, to continue to open the diplomatic channels with China and with other countries, Mr. President. And for me, that is the best approach, Mr. President.
But forcing us out from these occupied territories is a potential threat, Mr. President.
It's a potential threat, Mr. President.
If that is so, Mr. President, has the Philippines filed a protest with the United Nations Security Council as required under Article 2 of the United Nations Charter?
Well, Mr. President, to answer your question directly, no. But to give the reasons on why that policy was undertaken, the best department to answer that is the Department of Foreign Affairs, Mr. President.
Kasi po, ang sagot natin is no, Mr. President, then the trend is more imagined than real.
Well, Mr. President, China has veto powers in the National Security Council, Mr. President. So yeah, that's why we have to strategize very carefully, Mr. President.
Kanina po, Mr. President, sa aking pagtatanong, I was trying to differentiate po kasi dahil nga sa sigalot sa West Philippine Sea, ang dami pong misunderstanding dyan, ang daming misconception. Kaya po kung minsan ay hindi nagkakasundo ang iba't ibang mga mamamayan natin. For example po, yung pinag-uusapan lang dito sa tinatawag nating West Philippine Sea na hanggang ngayon hindi natin talaga malagyan ng exact coordinates, ano-anong mga features niyan, ano-anong mga forma niyan, para sa ganun kung tayo makikipag-away talaga, makikipagdigma, alam mo naman po natin ang ating ipinakikipaglaban. Kasi po, ang pinag-uusapan po pagka sovereign rights lang, ito po ay mga functional jurisdiction over areas that are not territories. Katulad po ng binabanggit nating exclusive economic zone. Kasama na po yung contiguous zone, yung continental shelf and even the extended continental shelf. Hindi po mga teritoryo to Napagkakamalan po na teritoryo, kaya nagkakaroon po ng mahabang pagtatalo. Sovereign rights, Mr. President, is different from territorial sovereignty. Iba po yung sovereign rights sa sovereignty. Yung Estado po, katulad natin, have full sovereignty rights and jurisdiction over our territory. So we can apply our entire range of laws, whether constitutional, administrative, civil, criminal, or commercial, to all persons and properties and activities within our territory. subject to the rights of innocent passage, sea lane passage, open sky passage, and sovereign diplomatic immunities. Ang kaiba po nito, in contrast, yun pong mga tinatawag nating maritime rights. Halimbawa po, itong binanggit natin kanina, contiguous zone, EEZ, continental shelf. Ang may apply lang po natin dito ay mga batas or regulations relating to customs, taxation, immigration, and sanitation. Sa exclusive economic zone po, Mr. President, and continental shelf, even the extended continental shelf, ang mag-a-apply lang po rito ay batas tungkol sa energy, fisheries, and maritime genetic resource, exploration and exploitation of artificial structures, marine research, pollution control, seabed pipelines, and cables. So kailangan po kasing may paliwanag ito in defense of what we perceive as West Philippine Sea. Yun pong maritime rights sa tubig lang, hindi po territory na kagaya po ng ating gustong ipaliwanag na mabuti. Para sa ganon, ay alam po natin kung ano ang ating pinag-uusapan, saan po natin gagamitin ang budget, at kung tayo po ay makikipagyera, alin-alin po ang dapat nating ilaban na sa ganang atin, Mr. President. So, salamat po muli, Mr. President, sa panahon pong ibinigay ninyo. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming
Mr.
salamat.
Sponsor, sa inyong panahon at pasensya.
Maraming
Thank you
salamat
very
po,
much.
Senator Marcoleta. At
Thank you.
nakikinig po ang inyong kababayan na taga-Tarlac rin, si Secretary Teodoro. At siya po ay siniseryoso niyo po ang inyong mga mungkahi at suggestion. So maraming salamat po.
Patating na eh. Patating na. Patating na. Is